This presentation is merely a brief overview of the topics covered in the chapter and should not be considered a substitute for reading the chapter. This chapter covers income and expenses, assets, debt and equity, and income and risk. Income is a cash inflow. In other words, it is money that comes to you. There are three ways to earn income: selling labor, which means working; selling capital, which is investing; and renting capital, which is lending to gain interest income. Expenses are cash outflows for items that are consumed. You, like all people, continually consume, so you have recurring expenses. Most of us have expenses for housing, transportation, food, and entertainment, just to name a few. If your income is greater than your expenses, you have a budget surplus. In other words, you have money left over after you've paid your expenses. You can do with this money as you wish. Getting ahead in a personal financial sense almost always requires creating a budget surplus and then investing that surplus. If your income is less than your expenses, you have a budget deficit. This means that you run out of money and probably have to borrow to pay your bills. This is extremely undesirable. Possible solutions to turning a budget deficit into a surplus are to increase your income, maybe by getting a second job, and/or cut your expenses. An asset is any item with economic value that can be converted to cash. Assets are resources that can be used to create income or reduce expenses and to store value. Here we see three assets: gold, stock, and a house. Let's look at what these assets do for us. While there are some generalizations here and it is possible to find exceptions, it is most likely that one invests in gold to store wealth and potentially increase income by buying low and selling high. Stock is usually held for the same reasons. A home may reduce our expenses over the long term when compared to renting, and it typically stores wealth fairly well. Most of us are probably all too familiar with debt. Technically, debt means renting someone else's money for a period of time. We usually call this renting borrowing. While debt, such as credit card debt, that carries high interest rates and is used for unnecessary items is bad, some debt, like student loans, which allow us to get an education we might otherwise not have been able to obtain, is good. Equity represents ownership. Let's pretend that you want to buy a vacation cottage and you have saved $100,000 for such a purpose. You find the perfect cottage, but it costs $150,000. Instead of saving up the extra $50,000 or borrowing it, you decide to approach a friend who will put up $50,000 to buy part of the cottage. You spend $100,000 and your friend spends $50,000. So you have 2/3 ownership and your friend has 1/3 ownership. These ownership stakes represent equity. Now let's look at another way you could have bought the cottage. You could have borrowed $50,000 from the bank. Of course, you would have to pay the money back plus interest, so it would cost you more than $50,000 over time, but you would own 100% of the cottage and not have to share it with your friend. Finally, let's turn our attention to risk. We must not put all of our focus on getting more of what we want. We must also focus on protecting what we have. Most of us have two sources of income: labor and investment. Those sources of income are at risk. Laborers can lose their jobs due to economic downturns or poor performance. They can also have accidents or illness that causes them to be unable to work, so selling their labor is no longer an option. With investments, we know that not all of them pan out. Sometimes we pick winners and sometimes we pick losers. How can we minimize the risk to our income sources? Diversifying or spreading our risk is probably the best way. By not putting all of our eggs in any one basket, we minimize the risk to significant sources of our income. We diversify our labor by learning as many skills as possible instead of just being really good at one thing. We can also sell our labor to more than one employer, or perhaps start our own small business on the side. In investing, we can spread our risk by diversifying our portfolio so that it includes stocks, bonds, mutual funds, real estate, and other investments. Taking these steps can help minimize our risk and make us sleep better at night. That concludes this presentation. I hope you enjoy reading the chapter.